I read a quote just recently from the comedian and movie star Jim Carrey. And it kind of surprised me. So probably most of you remember Jim Carrey from movies like Dumb and Dumber or Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. So he made a fortune basically by acting like an idiot. But it also sounds like he has learned some things along the way. And I say that because of this quote. He wrote, "I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer." Jim Carrey knows. He's been there. King Solomon, one of the most successful, most powerful, most famous people to ever live, felt the same way. Solomon ruled over a united Israel at the height of Israel's power. He built the temple in Jerusalem. He wrote down the wisdom that we just recently studied in the book of Proverbs at the beginning of the year. He also wrote another book called Ecclesiastes. You heard it. It's an Old Testament book. And if you've never read it, it's really kind of dark and depressing in a lot of ways. It sounds to me, based on what I've read in Ecclesiastes, that Solomon got to the pinnacle of his power, wealth, and fame, and he discovered that it wasn't enough. He discovered a harsh truth. In the opening chapter of Ecclesiastes, he writes, "I, the teacher, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is vanity and a chasing after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I perceived that this also is but a chasing after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow." So Solomon discovered that even something we would all consider to be pretty worthwhile, right? Pursuing wisdom and knowledge, even that was chasing after wind. He realized that none of the things we typically associate with living the good life gets us where we really want and need to be. And so in the end, Solomon concludes, and this is really the kind of the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes, that the only real way to experience happiness and peace in this life is by trusting God, by surrendering our lives fully to Him. That's where He comes out. I remember when that truth first hit home for me, in not just in an intellectual way, but in an existential way. I was a pretty ambitious young man. I went straight from high school to college to seminary. I did it about as fast as you could. I didn't take a break. I was married at 21 when I was still in college to a former model. We started having kids when I was 24, and I was the senior pastor of one of the largest churches in Ohio at the age of 28. So I had a successful career. I had a nice home. I had everything I ever thought I wanted. So I didn't understand how I could possibly be depressed. Didn't make any sense. I can remember saying to my doctor, there's no reason for me to feel like this. I'm exactly where I wanted to be. But somehow, it wasn't enough. I had this constant feeling of low-level anxiety that just wouldn't go away. Now, I know that's just what it feels like to be an adult, right? It's how we all feel. But at the time, I thought I needed medication. At the time, I tried numbing myself in other ways too. I also remember during that time, I kept having nightmares about being on a plane that was crashing, or in a vehicle that was careening out of control. And in those dreams, I wanted to be in control. I wanted to be at the wheel, but I couldn't. The funny thing is, when I was having those dreams, again, things in my life were pretty good and pretty much in control. 10 years later, however, it was a very different story. And I learned then how not in control I actually was. Some of you have heard me tell my story before, and some of you may not have heard all of the details, but long story short, there was a divorce and a bankruptcy. If Tammy hadn't come along when she did, I probably would have lost the house to foreclosure where my kids were raised. At that point, I wasn't even sure if my ministry might come to an end, so it was bad. But as many people who've been through stuff like that will tell you, I also learned a lot about myself during that time. I also learned a lot about what it means to really live in faith and to trust God. Something else I really began to understand in a different way as well was Jesus' sacrifice, his suffering. I began to understand that in a whole new way. And I remember the night vividly. It was on a Maundy Thursday, so that's the Thursday night before Easter when Jesus celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples. So on this particular night, we were doing a joint service with some of the other Christian churches in Dayton, and we'd spent the night remembering Jesus' Last Supper. There'd been a meditation about Jesus' suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane, where when Jesus was so overcome with emotion and anguish, really, that Luke writes, in his anguish, Jesus' sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. That's how intense it was for him that night. So for the first time in my life, I identified with Jesus' suffering. So maybe not the physical pain he experienced on the cross, but instead the emotional anguish that led up to it. Abandonment, betrayal, loneliness. I got it. It was one of the biggest aha moments of my life. As I was driving home in the rain that night, thinking about Jesus' experience in those hours before his arrest and ultimately his crucifixion, the full weight of his grief and pain hit me, and when it did, all I could do was just pull over to the side of the road. I think the thing that blew my mind most, and still does, is the fact that Jesus chose that path. I didn't choose my path, believe me. Jesus chose that path. He chose the way of the cross. He could have mobilized his disciples to fight, and they would have. In fact, they were expecting to. Like the gospel hymn says, he could have called down 10,000 angels to destroy all those who opposed him. But he didn't. He chose another way. And that way was just as counterintuitive and just as out of step with this world then as it is now. Even Jesus' own disciples didn't get it at the time. Like everybody else in Jerusalem, they were expecting a Messiah who was going to rule like King David did. They were anticipating the day when Jesus would finally defeat their Roman oppressors, right? And run them out. And Israel would become a world power. We know that on Palm Sunday, on the day that Jesus and his disciples entered Jerusalem for the last time, two of his disciples, James and John, the sons of thunder, they came to Jesus and they said, "We want to sit one at your right hand and one at your left when you come into your glory." Little did they know that Jesus wasn't going to be lifted up on a throne or on a pedestal, but on a cross. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he tried to explain that to his disciples multiple times. So we're going to be looking at some of those texts over the next couple of weeks. One of my favorite examples is found in Mark. And so in chapter 8 of Mark, which we're going to read from in just a minute, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples said, "Well, some think you're Elijah, and other people think you're one of the prophets." So famously, Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And it was at that point Peter spoke up, and he said, "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah." And so he got the right answer. He got the right answer. He just didn't understand yet what that meant. And so in the next section, Jesus spells it out. And that's what we're going to read now in Mark 8, beginning at verse 31. "Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who would want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life?" Whenever I read this story, it still amazes me. Peter got the right answer. He said, "You're the Messiah. You are the Christ." In Matthew's gospel, and this story is in all the gospels, but in Matthew's gospel, Jesus even says to Peter, "And I declare to you that you are Peter, Petra, the rock, and on this rock I will build my church." So within the course of just a couple of verses, Jesus goes from calling Simon the rock on whom he will build his church, giving him a new name, to saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, not on God's things, but on human things." It's probably one of the biggest 180s of all time. Last week, I talked about how at the end of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, Luke said, the devil departed from Jesus until an opportune time. This was obviously one of those times. Peter was so sure that Jesus was going to choose the path of power and even violence that he rebuked Jesus. Can you imagine that? Peter rebuked Jesus. And Mark doesn't tell us what Peter said, but it's not that hard to figure out. He probably said something like, "No one is going to touch you, Lord, because we're not going to let them. That's not going to happen. You're not going to suffer and die. You are going to be glorified, and you are going to rule the world." And of course, we stand on the other side of the cross. We stand on the other side of the empty tomb, so we know how wrong Peter was and how wrong the other disciples were. But that doesn't mean we still don't buy into their way of thinking, because we do. The way of Jesus and the way of the cross is just as foreign to us today as it was then. I've heard stories the last couple of years about pastors especially in evangelical churches, reading from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, like as a part of a sermon or whatever, and then being rebuked by their own church members from preaching some kind of political message after reading the words of Jesus from his Sermon on the Mount. Now that tells me a couple of things. Number one, it tells me that the teachings of Jesus have taken a back seat to the cultural and political forces that are currently at work in our world. I don't really have any doubt of that. But number two, it tells me that Jesus' teachings remain just as radical and as countercultural today as they've ever been. We live in a world and a nation that worships wealth, power, and fame. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. Jesus, on the other hand, chose poverty and powerlessness. He chose to love in a world that hates. He offered mercy when others sought vengeance, forgiveness when others condemned. Jesus denied himself and trusted God over and over again. And then he said, if you want to follow me, you've got to do that too. And that's not easy to do. Facebook friend of mine, some of you know, Tiff Williams, who used to be the director at our Christian Conference Center in Newton and is now serving a church in Texas. She posted a conversation this week between her and her daughter, Belle. And so Belle said, "Mommy, I can do the sermon this week. What were you going to talk about?" And then Tiff replied, "Loving your enemies and praying for people who are mean to you," which, by the way, is taken right from the Sermon on the Mount. And Belle then said, like most of us would, "Never mind, you better do it." Even kids get it. Not easy. Jesus said, for those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. That might be one of the most seemingly contradictory statements in the history of the world. Right? Sure, sounds like a paradox to me. But it's true, because the more you cling to your life or to anything else other than God, right? The more you cling to it, the more likely you are to watch it slip through your fingers. And I know because it's happened to me. I know it's a cliche by now, and there's even a country song about it, so that really tells me there's a cliche. But the only way to experience real peace and contentment is to let Jesus take the wheel. Back when I was having all those dreams about crashing airplanes and careening cars, my unconscious mind was insisting that I do something because I felt like I wasn't in control. And the reason I felt like I wasn't in control is because I wasn't in control. Control is an illusion. I mean, there's some things we can't do, but for the most part, we're not. Some wise person once wrote, "You are not in control. You never have been in control. You never will be in control. You never should be in control. You're not in control of everything. You don't make the sun come up. You don't make the sun go down. You don't make your heart beat. You don't make your blood circulate. There is a God, and you're not it." Now, of course, the fact that we're not in control doesn't stop us from trying. But like Jesus said, it doesn't work. The way to real life is letting go of control. It's about letting Jesus take the wheel. It's about trusting God with everything. We are called to live a cruciform life. And I love that phrase, and probably we'll come back to that again in the weeks ahead. Cruciform means cross-shaped. Crucified, cross, form means shaped, means that we are to live a cruciformed life. So like the vertical part of the cross, right, the part that goes up and down, we're connected to God in love, putting our faith and trust fully in Him. The horizontal part of the cross is our love and service to one another. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? You might remember that He said, love the Lord your God with heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's the cruciform life in a nutshell, right there. But it actually goes beyond that. It also means actively humbling yourself. Not something that's easy to do because we want to grab control. We want to keep it. As the Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the Philippian church, have the same mind in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though He was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied Himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, He humbled Himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Have the same mind in you that was in Jesus. Not your own mind, not your own will, and certainly not that of some politician or movie star or musician or sports figure or anybody else. Jesus' mind. Jesus humbled Himself and became obedient, even to the point of death. When the time came, He willingly picked up His cross. May we go then and do likewise.